Welcome everybody to my Friday evening show. I'm getting started a bit early on this one. I don't intend for it to be really long, but it might be only because I have to go over some different information, not only as it pertains to the media narratives we see, but also as it pertains to the order of events as they're actually literally going to come as well. Not only based on the Bible, but also based on common sense and reality, military reality as it stands. I see somebody's in here. Let's see who just came in. Hey, Brogan, how you doing? But yeah, I'm going to explain some matters as they pertain to the armed forces situation around the world and how it relates to exactly what's going to happen in the future and why that's the case. So, hey, Juan, good to see you, and Patty, good to see you too. So, as it stands, today we see a lot of people discussing the speculation around these alleged, Chi-Com balloons. And I had made a post about this. Even if they are Chi-Com owned balloons or American, it doesn't matter. The point that I was getting at is that if it is the Chi-Coms, the word if it is the Chi-Coms, they absolutely do not have to rely on balloons to do really anything. As you can see, hey, Welder Princess, as you can see by my thumbnail, that is a picture of a WZ-7 stealth drone, a high-flying, extremely high-altitude spy drone that the Chi-Coms have. It's called the Soaring Dragon, or the WZ-7. This is a stealth drone. It's capable of extremely high altitudes for the use as a spy drone, but also potentially targeting by relaying coordinates and information to missile forces like the Chinese Strategic Missile Forces, who are themselves in possession of a vast array of different types of conventionally armed and also even some fissile material armed weaponry. I'm trying to avoid saying a lot of words because for the obvious reasons, because these videos lately especially tend to lose me quite a lot of subscribers because they're getting unsubscribed from me, and it's also being kept from a wider audience. So I'm going to be really careful and guarded how I talk. It's a damn shame I have to do that. But because I'm getting off the tubes relatively soon anyway, I'm at least going to try and leave the tubes with my channel as unscathed as possible. So anyway, you have drones, high-flying stealth spy drones like the WZ-7, the Soaring Dragon, as the Chi-Coms call it. But you also have a vast array of different spy aircraft, ranging all the way from jet aircraft that are built off of extremely high altitude, strategic heavy bomber aircraft, or you have lower flying aircraft that are also built off of prop plane platforms like the Shangji Y8DZ, which is an electronic spy plane for electronic signals intelligence, ELINT, and electronic warfare capable spy plane. And you also have the Y8E, the Shangji Y8E, which is a drone launching aircraft for launching all kinds of armed and unarmed drones. You have also other drones that are capable of high altitudes, like the Wing Loong 1 and 2. both of those platforms basically, one being the original and the two being the upgraded, heavily modified form of this armed, high altitude capable drone, which, unlike our Predator drone, which can carry two missiles, this is capable of carrying 12 missiles and an array of other types of armaments, from what I've read up on it. So this high-flying armed drone and the WZ-7 drone, which is a extremely high-altitude spy drone, which is also stealth capable, are some of China's vast array of recon assets that they are easily capable of using, as opposed to these alleged balloons. Now, you have to understand, for them to use a balloon, if they were indeed doing it, that would be a means to an end for a different platform for recon, but it would also be something that was, being slower, being cheaper, being a dime a dozen, because these wouldn't matter. A high altitude balloon would absolutely not matter to the Chi-Coms nor anybody else using them, because these are extremely cheap. They're extremely easy to produce. I mean, it's not like it costs a lot of money for them to produce these. So if they were using them as a means by which to test our air defenses and the response of our leaders, if that was indeed what they were using them for, or to humiliate them, by, seeing what they would do and seeing them not respond to it by testing them and testing our air defenses, that would be the way to do it. Because if we did in fact, decide to, shoot them down, it would be no real loss for China. It wouldn't even matter in the grand scheme of things. It would just be there, because those things, again, they're a dime a dozen. They're not difficult by any metric or costly to produce. You can practically throw something like that away. It's disposable. It's completely disposable. So it's not like it would even matter, provided we did actually choose to shoot something like that out of the sky. So it's like a win-win. They get to test the response. If we do respond and shoot it down, then, until we actually manage to do that, they already got whatever they were looking for out of that. And, if we didn't do it, then okay, well, it's just the same, then those balloons got to travel across our airspace, vast swathes of it, and cover a whole broad array of territory. Now, of course, we have balloons too, just like, the Chi-Coms and the Russians and everybody else, but we use these balloons ourselves as recon assets. We even had balloons over our forward operating bases in Iraq to serve as like spotter balloons for any type of enemy activity outside of our forward operating bases, as a form of defense for the FOB. They were tethered to the ground, and on top of these balloons, they had different cameras that could, observe the entire area around these forward operating bases. So, balloons, while they have a lot of utility and they're useful, they're not like a be-all, end-all. No, China wouldn't have to use a balloon to launch some kind of EMP. They've got satellites and a whole shit ton of satellites. They've got vastly highly capable aerial platform weapons. They have the world's single biggest combat air fleet in the number of combat planes they possess. They might not have the overall biggest air force just yet, because they don't have the number of support aircraft that we do. We just have this gargantuan support aircraft fleet, like our Air Mobility Command, consisting of all our transport aircraft. We have a lot of mid-air refuelers. We definitely have a lot of trainer aircraft, in addition to the huge fleet of transport aircraft. We have mid-air refuelers, like I said, and AWACS and other such systems. But in terms of our combat air fleet, we do not have anywhere near the amount of combat planes that China has. And China has recently begun to start trying to catch up in terms of support aircraft categories. And they've been building support aircraft like you wouldn't even believe. But you basically have it in such a way to where these balloons wouldn't really even matter in the grand scope and scheme of things. I don't know why everybody's freaking out about it. I mean, you know what I'm saying. There's vastly more serious aerial threats than high altitude balloons. Like I mentioned, they have extremely high altitude spy drones. They have extremely high altitude spy planes, and they also have satellites. So it's not like as if that their satellites weren't fully capable of monitoring what goes on inside of our country. Same with the Russians, same with everybody else. They all have that ability to monitor what goes on inside our territory. So these balloons, I think, is a bit of a overreaction to what it really even would mean. And that's provided if these were in fact Chi-Com recon drones, because you hear about people raising doubts. And look, when I made that post, I didn't say definitively that they were or weren't, but I was speaking in terms of if they were, provided if they were. China wouldn't need high altitude balloons to carry out an EMP, nor would they even need to carry out an EMP to begin with. Folks, I've showed you all what it looks like when we get invaded. Those hypotheticals were created to convey all that information, to show people the steps and the process that would go into such a thing. They've had their forces within our borders and surrounding our country in Canada, Mexico, Bahamas, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, you name it. They've had forces in all throughout North American territories and countries. They've had their forces for, at the bare minimum, at least the past 20 years, okay? Because that's how long that they've owned our major ports. I went over all the biggest ports that they owned in, I think, what was it, was last live show I did before my audiobook part, or maybe it was the one before that. I went over these specific ports that the Chi-Coms have owned, including our biggest West Coast ports, including LA, Long Beach being the biggest on the West Coast, and they also own the Seattle port as well for 20 years. Some even longer. They had Miami, they had other ports as well, So it's not like they hadn't had the time to, with all the CCP properties they've built up within our nation that they purchased and sucked up, to be able to station a mammoth amount of Trojan shock armies. It would not be hard for them to move their forces from ports inland to their CCP properties in every corner of it. All they would have to do, literally speaking, is where they owned port terminals, they would arrange to pick up their military equipment over the span of 20 years for their different units and drive them inland under the cover of night, and have it done by CCP-friendly truck drivers or trucking companies, or CCP personnel themselves, be that, Chi-Com Army truck drivers, PLA truck drivers disguised as civilian laborers or whatever. They would have them doing that. And in the span of 20 years' time, can you even fathom the amount of vehicles, logistics, and everything else that they brought inland to those properties? They only would literally at that point have to rotate the personnel in and out on deployments. Like I showed in all my invasion work, they would have undercover deployments where they would come in posing as students on student visas or workers of different types, or maybe even illegal, border jumpers that would come in and, they would just go and find their pre-assigned CCP properties. And also that would also be, in every case of the word, the same situation as it would relate to the Chi-Com allied countries, including Russia, including Pakistan and North Korea, which both of the latter nations are basically, for all intents and purposes, just simply appendages of China. And I've gone over that before too. More or less, they're just Chinese satellite countries. They're satellite nations of China. And one, it's because during the Korean War, China literally is the entire reason that they're even a nation, which being in the case of North Korea. Without China, North Korea would have been unified under Southern rule. But because of China, North Korea is even a nation to this very day, because China bailed them out in the Korean conflict, because they were literally on the verge of being totally vanquished by the time the Western, what they called at the time, United Nations coalition, reached the borders of China. The North Korean People's Army was really, for all intents and purposes, utterly vanquished. I mean, it was basically gone, and so the vast majority of the conflict from that point forward was waged by the Chinese. I mean, yeah, sure, there were some few remaining KPA units, but by and large, the Chinese were the sole combatant from that point until the conflict began to seesaw on the 38th parallel. So China saved North Korea. So hence North Korea owes China for its entire existence, for literally everything. And you could say the same, or similar at least similar, in the case of Pakistan, because Pakistan had their military highly modernized by the Chi-Coms, who went in there and literally built them brand spanking new factories to license build Chi-Com military equipment within Pakistan. So also, Pakistan purchased, until the Chi-Coms built them, their new armaments industry, their new military industrial complex. Before that, they had started to purchase Chi-Com equipment. Like I've said before, and even in my audiobook, before the Chi-Coms went in there and modernized Pakistan's military industrial complex, Pakistan had been a big consumer of American military equipment, but China's equipment is vastly newer, vastly more capable. And the reasons for that is you have China, the biggest producer of tungsten, titanium, steel, aluminum for their aircraft and helicopters and drones and such. You have them also being the biggest zinc producer, among other different metals that have applications in military production. And now you have metals like tungsten, which is extremely potent as a defensive and offensive armament, for vehicles and for anti-materiel rounds for bullets, and also sabot ammunition for tanks. When it's bound by the right binding agent, it's the hardest metal on the face of the earth. Up there, with maybe the close competitor being depleted uranium, but still tungsten it's extremely hard. It's like gold. Gold in its purest state is very brittle. It falls apart. But, while tungsten is very similar in that regard, when it's not completely pure and it's bound by the proper binding agent, be that nickel or whatever else, tungsten is extremely powerful. And you would only really need a very small percent in a steel alloy to make that metal some of the strongest armor on the face of the earth as it applies to their vehicles, their ground vehicles, like their tanks, like their infantry fighting vehicles, armor personnel carriers, like, whatever else, they artillery pieces, if it's self-propelled artillery, whatever they want to put it in, it'll be some of the most potent metal you can imagine as a form of armor protection. And they by a long shot produce the most tungsten. Same with their steel production and same with the titanium production, because they alone literally produce, and titanium is a pretty strong metal too. They alone produce over half of the world's entire titanium supply. China does. China produces the most aluminum, which means their aircraft industry is just, it's cranking out aircraft left and right like it's nobody's business. I mean, and I'm being very serious. They have the largest capacity to manufacture aircraft of any nation on the face of the earth. You see, folks, that used to be, during the Cold War, it used to be the Soviet Union that could crank out aircraft like you couldn't even imagine. But, after the collapse of the USSR and the breaking up of its industries and having had fallen behind for a few decades before they started to become resurgent and rebuild themselves up, it had been the USSR before the collapse of it that had been building the most aircraft, tanks, everything else. That's why they have so many leftover munitions and armaments, vehicles, from the Cold War, because the USSR used to produce things like how China is producing them now. China is enormous in terms of their industrial might, their economy, their real economy, not their fake economy like what we have with our funny money and Ponzi schemes and usury and debt. No, they have a real economy with 40% of the entire world's manufacturing base alone in just their country, in just China. They have a real economy. And out of that manufacturing base, they have the largest by far in terms of output and everything. They have the largest military-industrial complex on the face of the earth. For them to be able to have a capacity to produce 400 fighters or tactical ground aircraft in a single year is enormous. It's enormous. Russia can only produce 150 in a year, while China has the capacity to produce 400. So that's really saying something. You know how many we can produce? We can produce only 80 aircraft a year, because we lost our Cold War industry too. We used to be the second biggest aircraft producing nation in the world after the USSR. But we really lost that because we got too comfy and too complacent when the Cold War ended. And besides all that, you have all types of sabotage occurring internally and externally, which has allowed our industries to fall to the wayside and allowed our factories to basically be stripped of all their machinery. Not just machinery, but the buildings themselves to literally collapse in and on top of themselves. We used to, I remember back in the 90s, you would see heavy industry throughout the country. Where I grew up at, there was a lot of heavy industry in southeastern Pennsylvania. And then you know what happened? Lots of those factories shuttered or they minimized. In fact, there was a corporation that my dad worked for that had a large plant in Lancaster, and this plant was enormous. It was multiple floors, and it was enormous in terms of the campus that it covered. Well, guess what? All that got shut down. And that just didn't just happen to our civilian industries. It happened all throughout this country to military related heavy industries as well, to where our capacity for producing aircraft, not just the aircraft themselves, but the raw material needed to build the aircraft, like the aluminum and other parts, titanium, aluminum, everything else. All of that went to the wayside as well, to where you now have China as the single largest largest producer of these items, of the raw material and the ability to produce the aircraft themselves. So that's really saying a lot. That's really saying a whole lot. Ground vehicles as well. We've really fallen behind in terms of our ground vehicle designs, because literally now for about going on 50 years, 40 going on 50 years, we have not had any new designs. We've simply taken old platforms and just upgraded them. The only areas where we've had any types of new design was in aircraft and ships, and even then, it's only been a few. Like in terms of aircraft, you've already seen the F-22, you've seen the F-35. In terms of the ships, you've seen the Zumwalt, which is a complete failure of a vessel, by the way, but you've seen the Zumwalt, you've seen, other new designs, but nothing really monumental that would be like change the course of a war. Because regardless, you still have China with some of the newest and most innovative designs on the face of the earth. They have mastered virtually all key areas of technology that even matter. They have the same or better high technology that we do too, which would even include potential anti-gravity craft like the TR-3 A and B. You would have China easily being able to produce things like that, because back in the 90s, they've gotten the crown jewels of everything. And China doesn't have to hide all their special technology beneath, some area, whatever, ascribe a number. No, they don't have a problem with secrecy in their country, because it's a despotic totalitarian regime. It's a police state. If there was only at least one benefit to living under such a despotic system where AI literally monitors everybody, cameras monitor everybody, the MSS monitors everybody, the Ministry for State Security, their secret police and CIA type agency rolled into one. If there was only one benefit to all of that, it's that people keep secrets, because people know that if they step out of line, they're going to get squashed. So China doesn't have to hide their high technology away in some deep underground, city somewhere. No, they can produce it in factories, and they can mass train people on the use of it and deployment of it. China is very secretive insofar as their entire nation is concerned. They're not quite like North Korea level, but they're secretive enough to where they don't have to worry about spies and all this other stuff, because they have the surveillance equipment everywhere. I mean, if you just look at the streets in China, they can monitor literally anyone and everyone at any time. They have AI systems, which they've mastered AI and robotics, controlling everything in that country, making the job of the MSS and other Chi-Com security forces just that much easier, to where they don't have to worry about secrets being leaked or anything else. To get information out of China, you would have to be like, you'd have to be on a level that was, vastly superior to even James Bond, with the way they portray him. You'd have to have some just, little g godlike abilities to be able to smuggle information out of there. But they have basically all of these different technologies and weapons at their disposal. They're building miniature artificial stars. They've mastered the use of plasma energy sources, to where they've released them up into the sky to show off. If they're using those items to harness energy within plants, then you know already that they've weaponized such items. They have mastered the use of particle colliders, and they have them in China. They have all of this tech in China. They've mastered AI and robotics. They can easily pair the two together. They've mastered hypersonics. They've even taken them to the next level with fractional orbital bombardment, which is where they fire a high altitude rocket into the air that detaches a hypersonic glide vehicle for the terminal phase of the attack after it's traveled around the world one time. They've tested it a few times, and they've fine-tuned it to where it's basically dead on point accurate. So even before they've fine-tuned it, if you equipped a nuke to something like that, it's still going to be pretty damn effective, because you don't really have to worry about pinpoint accuracy when you're using a weapon that destroys multiple square miles of territory. But they have fine-tuned it, and they have gotten it down to where it's dead on point accurate. They've already mastered ordinary hypersonics before going on to developing and mastering their fractional orbital bombardment systems. They have all this stuff. They have all of this. So a balloon, it takes me back to my original point. Balloons are really not that big of a deal. They're really not like anything that anybody should really be overly worried about, because when China has all this additional stuff that's far more effective, that most likely wouldn't even be detectable, why worry about balloons? To me, it seems like a distraction. It seems like a big distraction, and from something else. And if they are doing it just to test things, to test the waters, to see how we would respond, it wouldn't even be a big deal if they got shot down. Because again, balloons are a dime a dozen, really like a dime every 2 dozen, because they're extremely cheap platforms. They cost virtually nothing to produce. They're not all that, they're not advanced. They're very low tech types of systems. So if they were using these balloons, the only thing that would make any rational, logical sense as to why they were doing it would be to test us, our reaction, our air defense, so on and so forth, test our leaders, or to humiliate our leaders, and, just as an extra, one extra form of recon. We already know that there's Chi-Com electronic warfare assets adjacent to our missile silos. They know where all our missile silos are. They know where everything is. SolarWinds was hacked. It was hacked by the REAL Ch1nese. China has the biggest single cyber warfare program on the face of the earth, both in terms of the number of personnel employed and in terms of the money that is sunk into it. They've gotten our crown jewels. They know where everything is. They've hacked SolarWinds. You even got American officers, and the Air Force officers admitting when this happened a few years back, they admitted, they said it out of their own mouths, that they don't know, but it's highly likely that our entire arsenal has been compromised. Folks, that means it was compromised, and that means that it wouldn't be no big deal for China to go in there and shut it all off with a cyber attack into the military networks, or they could just use the electronic warfare assets that are parked right outside of the missile silos themselves and shut off all the redundant systems. You know, otherwise, there's what do people think that all those Huawei towers are there for? What do people think that more advanced electronic warfare systems would be used for? It would be used to shut off our ability to even be able to carry out some sort of nuclear retaliation. China knows what they're doing. I put all of this into my stories because, again, this is exactly how things unfold. First and foremost, when they're ready, they activate their phone chains in order to bring all their troops to their muster and assembly areas. As they're holding their formations and doing their briefings, the Chinese are getting their FK-2000s, the Russians are getting their S-500s ready to both be able to down all our satellites, because that's what those are. Those are anti-satellite weapons. And again, they probably, even as advanced as those two systems are that China and Russia have, they probably by now have even more advanced systems. Because this system, China was the first country to shoot down satellites with ground-based systems. They did that in the early 2000s. So it stands to reason that both China and Russia have far more advanced systems than the FK-2000 and S-500s, respectively. So, again, their war planners know how many satellites, both civil and military, need to be swatted down from the sky. In other words, they will have, in the last 20 years, produced however many thousands of missiles were required to arm those launch platforms with, in order where they can keep reloading and shoot salvo after salvo after salvo to knock down all our satellites. As that's going on, by which point there would be Russian, Chinese, Pakistani, North Korean, Belarusian, Kazakh, Iranian, Cuban, whoever else. You would have all these different forces on their muster and assembly points on CCP regime properties if they're part of the Trojan shock armies, and if they're part of the externals who enter the country from outside of it as heavy-handed reinforcements for the Trojans who are already inside doing the heavy lifting. You would have all of these forces mustered on their muster and assembly points as these satellites begin to be knocked out of the sky in rapid succession. By which point also, in tandem with that, you would have the cyber strike, which would be something akin to the effects of what a ransomware thing would, or type of attack would do, but it would be vastly more widespread. It would affect everything. And unlike ransomware, where you pay to get it to shut off, the only way to shut it off would be to input a code into the system of attack in order to shut it off at some point down the road, whenever they're ready to do so, like what occurred in my stories and docuseries regarding the full-scale invasion. As that opening phase occurs, when we are made deaf, dumb, and blind without forms of satellite-based communications or intelligence, without any type of satellite GPS, without any form of computer usage due to the lack of internet, without any telecom available due to the lack of telecom, without the grid available because our entire grid is attached. The whole grid is attached. I say again, the grid is attached to the internet, meaning that anything hooked up to the internet can be hacked. So why? Why would they use an EMP? Why would they even do that? Why do they need to use an EMP when that's the least efficient thing they can do if their end game is to colonize our land? You don't go to war without a reason to go to war that benefits you. In the reasoning of China, according to their own words of Wei Fang and others, their reason is to colonize the United States, get its resources, its arable farmland especially, and human capital for slavery and organ harvesting and another form of slavery too that I'm not even going to say, but you all know what I'm getting at. That would be a massive windfall for China. Why, in that case, would they not at least try to preserve some of the infrastructure? Because they might not want to have to go in there and rewire literally everything if all the circuits have been fried in every single solitary building. Why would they not want to preserve that instead by using a cyber attack? See, you got to think about things like that. You got to think of where our enemies have basically invested a large portion of their money. Anti-satellite weapons, their gargantuan armies and air forces and navies, their capabilities in the cyber domain. I mean, it only makes sense. Hypersonics. I mean, all of these new weapons and technologies coupled together with their gargantuan militaries, especially in China's case, China literally has the population and demographics to have an army. They have the industry to equip it too. It would take time, of course, but they could do it. They have the numbers, the demographics, meaning the amounts of military-age males, even females if they so chose, but they wouldn't even need to do that, to still be able to have, with just the men, an army that's bigger than the entire United States population. They already have the biggest fighting forces on the face of the earth, with their nearly 30 million men under arms. They wouldn't even need to make an army the size of our nation's population, but I'm saying they could do it. No other nation on earth could do that. Not even India, who has the numbers, but they don't have the industry on the size of China's to be able to equip such a force. They just don't have it. Only China could have an army that big. Only they could have an army that big. I mean, I guess India could too, but they wouldn't be able to give them all firearms, I mean, really, India's industry is nowhere near what China's is in terms of its output, its size, everything. So with 40% of the whole world's industrial base in just China and the population of just China, they could raise an army up that's bigger than our country's population. I mean, they don't even have to, because they already have the biggest fighting forces on the face of the earth between their paramilitary, which is all combat trained and armed, and their ordinary military, and which is their active and reserve forces. So between all of that, they have almost 30 million men under arms. I've gone over all these numbers before. You should really go into my miscellaneous playlist and also, all my miscellaneous shows and my Friday shows playlist, and I explain all the numbers. Even down to the vehicles and weapons, everything. They're just freakishly massive. The Chinese are. They have the biggest tank fleet, which is all their numbers that are in storage for their reserves and paramilitary forces. That's their main battle tanks and light tanks. China has 23,100 tanks, between 19,300 main battle tanks and 3,800 light tanks. In the infantry fighting vehicle armor personnel carrier category, they have 39,400. Their MRAPs and armored truck category is 24,300. So when you add together 39,400 and 24,300, which would be altogether infantry fighting vehicle, armor personnel carrier, and armored fighting vehicles like MRAPs and armored trucks, you would get a number that is about 63,700. Do you know how many armored fighting vehicles and APCs and IFVs we have? We only have 20,000. We only have 20,000, meaning China has over 3 times more in that category than we have. And they have about 4 times the number of tanks when you include main battle tank and light tank together. The artillery, there's just no competition between us and China. Because China, for all intents and purposes, basically has the exact same number that Russia has. China and Russia both have the single largest artillery arm on the face of the earth. Each country does, because they're about tied. And they even have long-term storage numbers, which isn't in storage like regular storage for other units like reserve and paramilitary units. It's long-term storage where it's like warehoused. They have even more sitting in warehouses. So they have, all in all, they have 5,385 SPGs, 5,300 towed, and 6,200 rocket artillery together. And then they have an additional 10 to 12,000 plus in long-term storage of towed pieces and some rocket pieces. That's enormous. That's enormous. We don't have anywhere near that much. We have nowhere near that much. Nowhere. I can't remember our exact numbers, but I know we have around about 1,000 Paladin self-propelled guns, and our towed pieces is smaller than that, and our rocket artillery numbers, it's like, I want to say it's about 600 or 700 rocket artillery. So we really and truly only have about a quarter of the artillery that China has, or Russia. Just a quarter. And that's everything we have combined. So, and if you take the long-term storage numbers that China has, or even Russia too, we really have nowhere even close to what they have. Because those guns are still plenty effective, especially when paired with modern counter battery fire radar, modern fire direction control personnel and systems. Those guns that they have in long-term storage, if they just got a once-over refurb, would equip whole new artillery divisions and brigades just off of those guns alone. And that's not even counting new guns that China produces and cranks out every year. Or Russia for that matter, whose industry is on average about a third of what China's is in terms of their military industry. So air defense artillery, we come nowhere close in compared to China. China has the biggest air defense artillery arm on the face of the earth for air defense systems. Russia being second right after them, about 200 less average number of systems than China has, but there's still plenty, and they're pretty effective too. What the Russians have. Now, helicopters is just the only area really where China is sort of like behind on, but they've been ramping up helicopter production in the past few years. And they've been building hundreds each year, so they're going to be catching up here pretty quick. Pretty quick. So I said all that to say all this. There's nothing. See, any area where we might have a little more than China, like helicopters or aircraft carriers, China has the countermeasures to it, so it doesn't even matter. China, having by far the biggest air defense arm in the world, makes swatting helicopters down and aircraft too pretty easy for them, to where they don't even have to use their Air Force, who has the most combat aircraft of any nation on Earth, combat plane numbers. That's between their fighters, ground attack, and heavy strategic aircraft, heavy strategic bombers. That China has the single biggest, by far, combat air fleet. So that says a whole lot. That says a lot. They had the biggest single navy, and it's the most advanced navy now. I mean, look, it's just not a competition. It's not even close. So for China to use balloons yet again, I mean, that would be something that would be like a distraction, or because they're a dime a dozen, it would just be to test and see what we would even do. That's my conclusion. It's my honest conclusion. Would they serve as yet just one other additional recon system? Well, yeah, sure they could, but they're not the main recon system. That's what I'm trying to say, and that's even if these are what they're being purported to be. I'm not saying they are or aren't, but I'm saying if they were being used by the Chi-Coms and they began up near the Montana state line, so I'm assuming they came from Canada, where China is known, well established to have troops. I'm assuming they most likely are, in fact, Chi-Com balloons. But we use balloons too, and I think, just to avoid the embarrassment, when I watched that video where somebody said that, there was an American balloon on the flight transponder that came from, flight recorder rather, that came from Oklahoma, that was an American balloon, is what it showed up as. Well, the Chinese balloons wouldn't show up on our aircraft monitor, for one thing. But even if, and they didn't originate in Oklahoma. They came from up toward Montana. So, I'm just going to assume these are Chi-Com balloons. But again, I don't know for sure, but I'm just simply telling you, I'm simply making it known, that if they are indeed Chi-Com balloons, they're just used as a distraction or a test, because they have far more advanced recon assets than balloons. They don't need to use balloons, and they damn sure wouldn't use balloons to do an EMP. They don't have to do an EMP. They already have the world's most advanced cyber program, which I just spent a bunch of time explaining. I've shown in all my scenarios exactly what this is going to look like. Exactly, bar none, hands down, how this all occurs in terms of the order of events and what exact events it would be and why and how. So, people come up with crazy ideas about how certain things work, and you can tell some of these people have like no understanding of like key systems or what their purpose even would be, but it's fine for people to speculate. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that people come up with wild ideas about what certain things could be for and everything, and I'm not saying that to diss on anybody. I'm saying it because more often than not, the answer is a lot closer to simplicity. It's more of a simplified answer. What do they call that? The Occam's razor approach. Normally, things are a lot more simplified when compared to the, crazy ideas that people come up with. It's best to start with the most simplified explanation before then branching out to something else. But in order to branch out to something else, you should have evidence for it. If you can't prove it, like how I just spent all this time explaining how certain systems work and all the purposes behind them, the whys and the hows about it. If people can't explain their rationale, then they shouldn't get all like loopy in their explanations, trying to explain things and, trying to come up with crazy things about what speculations of what might be, when they should simply understand the purposes of such equipment, why it would be used, the most reasonable purposes as to why they would be used, and how and why, and what it would even have to do with, because more often than not, most things are actually not some like crazy way out there, type of explanation. When the truth is more, I'll just put it this way, where the truth is more um, rational. It's more rational, I'll just say. The truth is more closer to a rational, ordinary explanation. Now, I'm not at all saying, don't get shit twisted. I'm not saying that certain things out there aren't, out there in quotes in terms of like, their possibilities. But I'm saying that more often than not, it's best not to, you know, take certain things out of their original context insofar as, the purposes of such type of equipment and what their real capabilities are, because you have to really, really do your research. And that's the whole purpose of this channel. It's a research and information channel, and I stick to topics that I'm actually adept with, that I actually have a knowledge base in, that I actually have experience in terms of my actual combat experience in Iraq was concerned, and I blend that with my deep level of research into facts, figures, capabilities, factoids, other types of data and information, numbers and, figures. I look at various types of information and I blend it with my personal experience. And that's how I create those hypothetical scenarios, which, I'll just put it this way. The realistic fiction conveyed is only realistic fiction until it's not. Until it's not. Meaning that for now, what I've conveyed is realistic fiction, but it's going to come true exactly along those lines. Do you know why? Because if you read their literature, such as Unrestricted Warfare, which is actually a book written by two adjutant PLA colonels to a general in the PLA command staff in one of their units. I can't recall which unit. I haven't read that book in so long, but that was a big deal back in the early 2000s. So I read that, and at the time, I didn't think a whole lot of it, but the more and more I researched into China and Russia and these other nations and things that they've said and things that they've done insofar as what they've spent money on and what they've actually allocated resources to, and how China in particular has built up a mammoth-sized war industry, bigger than anyone else in the world. And all these resources and that they produce insofar as metals that are specifically for applications in vehicle production of different types, be it aircraft, be it ground vehicles, ships, whatever, weapons, the numbers that they produce, it becomes plainly obvious that they are getting ready to destroy the West. And that's exactly how they would do it, just like they've explained in Unrestricted Warfare, which in detail goes into hybrid warfare. And when you see realistic expressions of that put into real life, you've got the whole civil military fusion policy whereby CCP properties of civilian type can be used for the military, for military purposes, which applies to all the ports, the different farms and ranches, the solar and wind farms, their warehouses they've purchased, their old abandoned factories they've bought, everything they've bought, apartments, whole apartment complexes, houses, like small family-sized homes. Though all of that applies to hybrid warfare. All of that applies to hybrid warfare, because those all become FOBs, or combat outposts. A FOB, forward operation base, or combat outposts, called COPs, for short, or they become logistical importation areas like the ports, or troop importation areas like, again, the ports, or the air terminals. They own whole air terminals too. I mean, all of these are for logistical and troop movements. They have trucking companies and CDL holders that are private CDL holders that would drive that military equipment to CCP properties under the cover of night, because they have ports throughout the United States on both coasts, even on the southern coasts, like in Houston and such. They can truck all of that in under the cover of night and get it to where they need to go, because they're not going to have to drive any more than about 12 hours to the CCP properties they're moving their heavy equipment to. So most people are never going to see it. But just because they don't see it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, and isn't still potentially happening even to this day, even though they've had 20 plus years to move and shuffle equipment and forces around. Our border's been wide open in the south and in the north, making it even easier for foreign troops disguised as border jumpers to enter our land illegally. So people have to really think about everything in its proper context. People take things out of context. They, get really wild with their, assumptions about certain things. I mean, on this channel, I have basically dismembered multiple narratives using real facts and figures and stats and capabilities and numbers, factoids to do it, because I take all that information, I analyze all the information, and when I analyze the information, I use that analytical ability I have to put it all together to make a coherent big picture. It's called putting together a puzzle to make a big picture. That's what I do here. And that's how I create, with, even merging it with my own personal combat experience, to make those hypotheticals as realistic as possible. Because I take the capabilities of our enemies, their weapon systems, and I merge it with the experience I had over in Iraq. My personal experience, also that of those around me, just in general, just as an occupying force. And I combined it with what our enemies and their equipment are fully capable of. The weapon systems, the platforms, their troops, and how they train, what they're capable of. I've used historical references. I mean, just any number of different things. I put it all together to make a masterpiece insofar as that audio book and other resources on this channel are concerned. Even the map battles that take place on these larger regional maps, where every one of those battalions, or even in a few cases, even company-sized forces, wherever they manifest is where there's a CCP property. Those are Trojan horse shock armies. And I also show the external forces and how they enter this country from beach landings, parachuting in, and crossing the borders in both the south and the north to rush deep inland as fast as possible in a matter of a few days before they link up in the center. And they spread out, they fan out to help the Trojans already doing all the heavy lifting. That, mixed with high technology, is the full essence and product of fourth generation hybrid warfare. Fourth generation warfare or hybrid warfare is just two terms for the same thing. There's third generation warfare, which was just the blitzkrieg, where armies cross borders rapidly. Then you had second generation warfare, which was trench warfare. Then you had first generation warfare, where medieval, even ancient medieval, all the way to musket times, where you had two armies marching across fields at each other, shooting at each other with arrows or muskets, or, swordsmen, bashing into each other. That's first generation warfare. followed by trench warfare, World War I, and you've still seen instances of trench warfare in modern times, like in the Iran-Iraq War, and, like in aspects of what has occurred in the proxy country, the Western proxy nation. You see aspects of it, so, there's different generations, but the fourth generation of warfare will be the final generation of warfare, where the Trojans become the leading force in attaining victory. Because without them, in every corner of the land, it wouldn't be possible to subdue a large landmass like our country in a matter of several days. But when you have them beginning so close to their objectives in every corner of the land, there's no such thing as a front line, because you have the externals rushing in, and there's nobody able to stop them, because everything even behind the lines, what would have been the lines to prevent them from entering our country, you have Trojans beginning in every corner of our country. There is no front line. There's only battle lines where the forces actually fight one another at the time, because forces are steadily moving around. You got the Trojans moving around all throughout our country. There's no such thing as front lines in a war like that. So when the externals enter the country from both coasts and from, crossing both borders, they're basically entering and fanning out to assist those Trojan forces already inside, causing havoc within our borders, taking and capturing cities, installations, everything. There would be there's no way to stop an invasion like that. None. Zero. So, I just wanted everybody to be aware of that. I'm going to say my farewells for the night. Thank you, each and every one of you, for coming to my Friday show tonight. I kept it almost within an hour. Yeah, daughter of the Most High. Anytime people say stuff like that, I don't even worry about it. It's just a bunch of bunk BS. When whatever the DEF CON level really is, most likely people aren't even going to know. And something like that, a balloon, is not. That's not going to likely trigger that. It's just a foreign. If it is Chinese, if what they're saying is even true, it's just a foreign recon asset. That's all it is. The only thing that they would do, if it was really like a DEF CON 2 matter, they would have shot that thing down, but they didn't. They haven't done it. So at least as of the time I'm speaking these words, they haven't. And if they did while I was live, then I sure didn't hear about it. Thank you, Planet X Watcher. Well, Paula, I don't think that's actually true, because the DEF CON, there's DEF CON, which is the defense condition, and then there's an alert condition. So there's two different things, and the DEF CON relates to the wider threat of nuclear war as a whole, as opposed to the alert condition, which is more specific to a base. At least that's how it was when I was in the Army, and I'm pretty sure that hasn't changed, really. Back when I was in Fort Hood with 3rd ACR, we had different alert conditions for all kinds of different things. Like, I was there when, actually, I just got off of staff duty for the night. I was there when Hassan carried out his dirty deed he did, and that raised the alert condition substantially to where you had troops that were actually just ordinary troops issued ammunition for their rifles, and they were on patrols, because when I came in from staff duty, it was over a day later, because they locked down all of Fort Hood. And in fact, my first wife at the time, she went on the installation with me. Oh no, that was before I met her. No, something else happened when she went on the installation with me, and they had the alert condition raised again. This was around like 2011, And they had it raised again to where they had troops that were guarding the Darnell Army Hospital and all kinds of other things. So it's relative to DEFCON is more relative to nuclear war, and alert condition is more. I think people get those confused. That's more relative to individual posts, because Hassan triggered that when I was in Fort Hood with 3rd ACR at the time. He did that actually up where they used to do the medical boards for people that got injured in Iraq and Afghanistan. You'd go through a med board process, and he was one of the psychologists, or psychiatrists rather. He was one of the psychiatrists that did the paperwork for people's med boards, and he carried out that event, I'll just say. And I had just got off of work the night before or the morning before because I was on staff duty. It's 24-hour duty where you sit at a desk and you're basically like the building guard for all intents and purposes. You guard your unit building, and like the unit's barracks building, and you basically just sit there on duty. And after 24 hours, they let you go home, and you have another 24 hours off after that. You don't have to come in for another day. But man, when I came back, there were troops walking around with squad automatic weapons, the M249s. They had, those are the light machine guns. They had those. They walked around with their M16s and M4s, all over the base, in response to what that man did. So, yeah. And it happened another time, but again, I'm drawing a blank. I can't think of what happened in 2011, but something happened again in 2011 there. And my first wife at the time was there with me, and they had all kinds of guards posted right outside Darnell Army Hospital. So things were different. But that was due to the alert condition. Yeah, Paulo, yeah, so you know what I mean, Paulo. Yeah. You just got it confused. That's all. A lot of people get that confused between DEFCON and AlertCon. There's an alert condition, and then there's the DEFCON, which is a defense condition for the nuke arsenal or the nuke threat. But yeah, alert conditions are by installation. Those are by post. But yeah, it's all good. A lot of people get that mixed up. Hey, Ken, good to see you, buddy. I didn't see you in there. Good to see you. And Jeannie not of this world, well, hello. Good to see you, too. Grandma Deb, and you're welcome, Grandma Deb, and Planet X Watcher, and Welder Princess, and Brogan, and Juan Munoz, and Patty. Well, welcome, everybody. Everybody that came in, welcome. And Daughter of the Most High, and Paula, everybody, welcome. Ken. Well, you all have a blessed night. You all take care.